Welcome to the Carpenter Law Firm's seminar on children and child care challenges in 2024 for churches in Arizona. It's May 16th, 2024. My name is Scott Carpenter. I'm an attorney at the Carpenter Law Firm. Welcome. This is a 59-minute bring your own lunch Zoom webinar. Happy to provide this information today. It is current as of May 16th, 2024. If you're watching this webinar in 2025 or 2026, no guarantee is made as to the accuracy of the information. So this is for churches in Arizona. There are a number of challenges when children are involved in the ministry of churches and children are involved in campus life and ministries on churches. And what we mean to be talking about today are really children under 18. We're talking about youth and junior high, babies, and any kind of ministry that involves children from birth through 18. So let's start into kind of how this evolves over the life of church and ministry. Been around churches my entire life. My father-in-law was involved in church work, senior pastor of churches for over 50 years. And so I've seen this up close myself. My wife and I have been involved in various levels of church ministry. My favorite was 5th and 6th grade. I tore a shoulder, labrum, throwing a Nerf football to a 5th grader one Sunday morning, and I felt it happen at the time, and I was bothered by that shoulder injury for years. So let's talk at first a minute about the old approach. And the old approach may be the current approach for many churches. I call this the old approach, and I mean intentionally to call it the wrong approach. The old approach is accept all volunteers, anybody who's willing to help. We just need warm bodies. We need people to help with youth, high school, junior high. We need people to watch kids and babies on Sunday mornings during church services. We need people midweek for the programming that occurs during the week. And we need anybody who's willing to help. Just accept everybody. Maybe we'll be concerned, underline maybe, we'll be concerned about background checks. Maybe perhaps we'll think about volunteer training. Maybe one day we'll think about evacuation training and planning in the event that the fire alarm goes off or that there's an active shooter. It's on the list. Maybe we'll get to it one day. That's the old approach. Maybe one day, but maybe we won't get to it. But planning and vigilance and adherence to the plan over time are a different issue. Of course, that's what needs to happen, is we need to plan for all of these things. And then there's a vigilance and adherence to the plan over time that needs to happen. And these, of course, are different things. What I've learned in 30 years of law practice and representing nonprofits and churches is that whatever we do, it always works perfectly on a whiteboard. The thinking and the planning, oh, we'll recruit volunteers and we'll train them. And then we'll stick to the plan. Put that on a whiteboard, and it executes perfectly. But there's no problem because we end it there. Everything works perfectly on a whiteboard. But over time, we lose adherence to the idea and the concern about all of these things, the background checks, the volunteer training. There might be an idea, the senior pastor and the lay leadership team might say, well, we need to do background checks. But who's doing the background checks? Is it the senior pastor? No, he is not the one, or she is not the one actually doing them. The task is delegated to someone else. And is the vigilance there over time? Probably not. And so we end up with a situation where the idea that the church does background checks falls apart over time because there's a lack of vigilance. Excuse me. And then we end up in a situation where we're back to the top bullet point on the screen. We end up accepting all volunteers, and the situation ends up being, well, who's watching the kids? Who's volunteering with the high school group? Who's leading our small group ministry midweek with our junior high girls? Well, we end up with a situation where we've accepted all volunteers, or more importantly, we do know who's leading our small group ministry of junior high girls, but we have no idea who's living in the home where the small group is meeting on Tuesday nights with those junior high girls. We don't know who's living in the house. So we have a situation where the 8th grade girls are meeting in the home of the leader, but who's living in the house and who's there in the back bedroom where the girls are meeting, and the restroom is down the hall, but who's living down the hall? Some stepson who just got released from jail or just got released from prison. How would the church know that? We don't have any way of monitoring that. Even the background check of the leader of the junior high girls small group is only checking the leader. She's passing the background check, but who's living in the house with her? The church doesn't know. So the old approach is not monitoring any of that because everything works perfectly on a whiteboard. So even when we're doing the background checks of the leaders, it's leaky. There's a lot of challenges that are going on. So there's a new approach. Liability is lurking for the church in corners where we're not even thinking. There are issues with children and childcare that we've got to be worried about. There's negligent and inadequate hiring. Who are we hiring for these roles? Who are we hiring for the youth pastor position? Is he or she passing a background check? Are we even doing that? Or are we hiring someone simply because they're fun, they passed an interview, they told a phenomenal story about forgiveness, life change, and redemption? Is that the issue that's causing that person to be hired? Is that the litmus test for hiring in your church? And that may be, and I have no issue with that. As a lawyer, that can be your hiring criterion, a phenomenal story of life change and forgiveness and redemption. But if the person has a background check issue that you didn't check, and then something happens, is a jury in the county where your church is a jury going to care about any of that when something bad happens? You've got a hiring problem and you didn't do a background check. There's a liability issue lurking there for the church. And maybe you're thinking, as I say this, well, we have insurance for that. Well, a bad thing happened. And you could keep that bad thing from happening by making a smart hiring decision. We also have liability issues lurking with negligent and inadequate training. I just mentioned that a few minutes ago. We've got to have great training with our volunteers. And we also have to have better screening of the environments where our volunteers are holding church off campus. Very concerned about this for my church clients, that church is increasingly being, programs are increasingly being held off campus. They're being held at Starbucks, they're being held in people's homes. Church programming is being done off campus. And I'm increasingly concerned and nervous that the church has no idea who's there. And so we have this situation where we've screened the leader. The leader is Becky. I'm making that up. Becky is the leader of the junior high small group of girls. 6 junior high girls are in the small group on the 3rd Tuesday or the 2nd and the 4th Tuesday, meeting at Becky's house. Could be in Tucson, could be in Mesa, could be in Prescott, could be in Flagstaff, it doesn't matter. The 2nd and 4th Tuesday, Becky is having the junior high girls over to her house for small group, we'll call it, junior high programming. That's part of church ministry. And Becky has not informed the church, she just didn't think it was important, that her 24-year-old stepson has just been released from prison and is living in the back bedroom, 4-bedroom house, and living in the back bedroom. He's back there consuming pot edibles, brownies, whatever, and watching TV, frankly, consuming a tremendous amount of porn. And he is back there in the back bedroom. These junior high girls during small group only have one restroom that they can use in this house. And during small group, every once in a while, one of these girls has to go use the restroom, wander down the back hallway, and he's back there and decides, well, geez, this is a great opportunity to harass one of these junior high girls. And you can see the problem. So all of a sudden, the church has a problem. Well, one of the girls ends up the victim of a crime, and the parents, of course, go crazy as they would and decide that the church has a liability. The parents hire a lawyer and figure out that this assault happened at a church event that occurred off campus from the church, and that the lawyer does an investigation and figures all of this out and decides to send a demand letter to the church, file a lawsuit against the church, and eventually the facts come out through depositions and discovery that the church did not know that this 24-year-old released from prison was in the house, because we have to tell the truth under oath. And we admit, we didn't know, we didn't check, we didn't ask. The background check only found out that Becky had no previous convictions from the background check. No questions asked. The church did not ask who else is living in the home. What environment are these girls going to be in? Does anyone else live in the home? What is their status in terms of their background checks, etc.? So we have these issues. So are we training Becky about what's going on? Background checks also have another inadequacy. Background checks are inadequate because offenders are rarely caught and convicted on their first offense. And I'm speaking here specifically about sex offenders. The estimates vary as to whether there are 20 or 30 or some other number of sex offenses before a sex offender is caught and convicted the first time. We don't know for sure because sex offenders who are convicted rarely admit how many times they offended before they were caught and convicted the first time. I mean, you can appreciate that a rapist is, after they're convicted and they're in prison, is not going to admit, well, I know I was caught and convicted of this rape. Now you're asking me how many rapes did I commit before I was convicted this time? That rapist is not going to say, well, I actually raped 30 people before I was convicted of this rape this time. They're notoriously not truth tellers. But there are estimates that sex offenders commit multiple offenses before they're caught and convicted the first time. And what we have to be concerned about in church work is, how do we guard against being one of those 20 or 30 offenses before someone is convicted the first time? Can we rely on background checks to filter out offenders who would be attracted to the soft target of volunteering for church work? Because church work is a soft target. People come to church, say, well, it's easy to get in. Nobody's standing guard at the door to keep me out. I will come to church. I get to know people. I'll volunteer to work with junior high or high school. Get to know people. I get to know the kids. I will hug the girls if I can get away with it. I get to know them. I'll groom them. And then when I get the chance, I will sexualize them and commit a sexual assault. I mean, churches are soft targets for this kind of thing. And background checks are often inadequate for the first-time offender who has not yet been caught and convicted. So background checks are not always adequate. So we have to have volunteer training. We have to be vigilant and look out for these behaviors. So these estimates vary, but if these estimates are true, then we've got to look out for behaviors and have great volunteer training. So when we do a background check and we find that there are previous convictions, we ask ourselves this somewhat rhetorical yet hypothetical question: what previous convictions would disqualify someone from serving in childcare or serving with youth? It's a sort of an interesting question. Well, let's answer the obvious. Murder. We wouldn't want a convicted murderer to work with youth. I'm chuckling as I say it because it's pretty obvious. A convicted rapist, we wouldn't want them working with youth. But what about a bar fight? If someone has been convicted of a previous assault and you ask the person about it and they say, well, I got off work and I went to Buffalo Wild Wings and I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan, and there was somebody there who was an Eagles fan, and we got in an argument, and I'm a Cowboy fan, so I can say this, and I would never get in an argument to that degree, and I've never been in a bar fight. I've actually never been in a fist fight, but you can imagine that somebody might say, well, I got in an argument and we ended up fighting, and this was 15 years ago, and it'll never happen again. I'm embarrassed by it. My wife was there, and I'm completely embarrassed by it. It's 15 years ago. You can imagine somebody saying something where you might say, well, okay, maybe you can work in the parking lot with traffic control, but you still have an assault on your record and you spend 18 months in prison. How about you work with facilities, or how about you work with traffic control? But each church has to kind of wrestle with what would disqualify someone from children and youth. But here's another one. What about a domestic disturbance with the person's spouse that the volunteer desperately wants to explain away? Kind of like the bar fight. Hey, I have an explanation for this. Dallas Cowboys, Philadelphia Eagles. I can explain it. Well, I had an ex-wife and we were going through a divorce, and it was really nasty, and she called the cops, and we were standing in the front yard and it was ridiculous. It was all her fault, blah, blah, blah. And then we get to really the most challenging part of background checks, and it's really this. I have it in bold. What about redemption and forgiveness? And this is where we end up with what's difficult for lawyers and difficult about the litigation and lawsuit process, and what's difficult about juries when these issues are litigated in court. And we end up in civil court where a victim wants $3 million. And here in Arizona, the husband and wife law team find a victim from a billboard and they want $3 million. And the jury is being asked to award $3 million from the church because a bad thing happened. And the bad thing that happened is there's a 24-year-old kid out of prison in the back bedroom. And oh, by the way, redemption and forgiveness. The church made a decision. There was this story. The church decided that there's a role to be played about redemption and forgiveness. There was a story, something happened on a background check, but here's what we were told. And the church believes in redemption and forgiveness. It's part of our mandate. It's biblical. Is a jury made up of an increasingly secular world we live in going to provide any room for that to matter when it comes to rendering their judgment based on the law? And the answer is likely not. It's not going to make any difference. So we're concerned as lawyers, and as I said, a long history of church service. It's in my blood, it's in my family. I've spent my whole life as part of this process and ministry. But so I get it. But it can be part of your mission and you can feel it. But the law wants decisions to be made based on the facts and an objective view of reality. And so when a background check comes up, you can feel that redemption and forgiveness is really an eternal question. It's really, for the higher power to decide, not for the church to decide to risk a victim. You can't risk a victim based on redemption and forgiveness. So if there's any chance that a church's decision to impart redemption and forgiveness to a person and to allow that person to be exposed to children under 18 because the church leaders believe that there should be a role for redemption and forgiveness, a jury is not going to appreciate that at all. There's a real risk that a jury is going to say, that was a terrible decision. You should never have allowed your instinct for redemption and forgiveness to put children at risk, not even a little bit, not even 1% risk for children because you believed that redemption and forgiveness played a role. So I appreciate the theological belief in redemption and forgiveness, but that's really God's role to provide redemption and forgiveness in this context. But if there's an objective basis to believe that someone could be dangerous, then the church needs to protect potential victims. That's really what the law wants. So campus safety, let's talk about that, because we're very concerned about evacuation planning on Sunday morning and at other times when the campus has children on campus during the week. we're concerned about a couple of things, really. We're concerned about evacuation of infants, rolling cribs, but we really need parental involvement to understand what will happen. Perhaps it's, hey, parents, if we have to evacuate, we're going to meet in the parking lot. And we're concerned about, are the parents aware of the protocol? It could be as simple as, just like in schools, when there's a school problem, whether it's an active shooter or a fire alarm sounding, everyone's got to go. We can't have the parents flooding the school when there needs to be an evacuation. Everyone knows this, that if there's an active shooter at a school, the last thing the school needs is for every parent to be driving to the school and interfering with law enforcement and flooding the parking lot with 500 cars, interfering with law enforcement. We all know this is exactly to be true. We can't have every parent running down the hallways trying to get to their kid when the volunteers need to be, in an orderly fashion, moving the children out of the classrooms to the parking lot if the fire alarm goes off. Early in my married life, my wife and I lived in Waco, Texas, and we attended a church there. And during the Christmas service, the pipe organ started to have smoke come out of the pipes, and the minister of music kept playing, and the choir kept singing in their robes. And my wife and I were sitting there in the pew thinking, looking at each other like, this is strange. The fire alarm is going off and he's singing like we're all going to go down on the Titanic. Now, of course, this was before the movie came out. This is the early 90s, late 80s, I suppose. And he just kept playing, kept directing the organist and the pianist and the choir to keep singing. And we looked at each other and I thought to myself, I think when the fire alarm goes off, you're supposed to stand up and leave the building. And ever since then, I've thought, if I hear the fire alarm, I stand up and I walk out of the building. And the few times when my office building, when the fire alarm has gone off, I stand up and I walk briskly to the exit and I go to the parking lot. And sometimes I'm joined by others, and other times when this has happened over the years, people stay at their desk and they keep working. But in church, we have to have an understanding that when the fire alarm goes off, we leave the building. Even if it's in the middle of the best sermon ever preached, that's what we do. Even if some kid pulled the fire alarm, we've got to move. And so even if every Sunday the volunteers say to the parents, the evacuation plan is we meet in the parking lot, that's what we have to do. And so parents need to be aware of the protocol. And if the parents say, I get it, I understand, you said it last week, that's better than a situation where the fire alarm goes off and people are trampled in the hallways. I'd rather that. I'd rather everybody be a little annoyed each week that the volunteers say the evacuation plan is we meet in the parking lot. That way, if the fire alarm actually goes off, everybody meets in the parking lot, the fire trucks come, and everybody's in the parking lot. Now, active shooter is a little bit of a different problem, but the evacuation protocol would basically be the same. We can't have people blocking the hallways when the fire alarms are going off. Everyone has to evacuate. So here's the question. Is your church prepared to avoid a civil lawsuit where children and parents are trampled by a lack of evacuation planning, even with a false fire alarm or active shooter? That's a question. And it's not just the infants in a rolling crib. And the reason the rolling crib is so important is because sometimes the ratios are off. The ratios in the infant room, might be 6 infants and 2 volunteers. I don't know what your ratios are, but I don't know about you, but I can't carry 3 infants on 2 arms. If I have 3 carriers, I can't carry 3 carriers. The ones that we carry babies in. So efficiently, we have to be able to put 3 babies in 2 rolling cribs, or 6 babies in 1 rolling crib. We've got to get 6 babies out of the room and out of the building with 2 volunteers. How are we going to do that if there are 2 volunteers and 6 babies based on the ratios? So I'm talking about the babies because they create most of the conundrum. Now we're talking about the toddlers or the under 5s. Maybe we need a rope with knots on it. We got to practice this stuff. The kids have to be aware that there's an evacuation protocol, but it's not just the kids, it's the volunteers who have to be ready when they work in those rooms. There's an evacuation protocol. It's not just about the fire alarm, it's about an active shooter, it's about other things. And what is the church doing to make these volunteers aware there's an evacuation protocol? Are we rehearsing it? Is there something being done by the leader of the volunteers, even if it's 10 minutes on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock or at 8:50 or 8:45? I need you there early this week so I can go over the evacuation protocol. We've got to be doing this at least once a month, at least every 2 weeks. And even if the person gets annoyed, you went over this last week, you went over this last month, I got it, I understand. That's the rope with the knots on it, so the kids can walk out and follow through the evacuation protocol. It's not a joke. But this is to avoid liability, because when there's a problem, because there's a failure to understand what's happening when a fire alarm goes off or there's an active shooter, there's a lawsuit. And there are plenty of lawyers, they're on billboards all around the state constantly, that are advertising for victims to sign up to sue for damages when there are injuries. What is the evacuation plan? And it may be campus specific. There are plenty of consultants who are ready to help churches figure out what these plans should be. Frankly, I don't think it's that complicated. I think any pastoral staff and lay leadership team can look at the campus and say, this is what the evacuation plan should be. But every church should have an evacuation plan. And it's not just about whiteboarding the evacuation plan. It's about looking at your personnel and saying, who's in charge of it and who's capable of being in charge of it and sticking to it. That's where it falls apart. You can designate Betty, the church admin, as being in charge of the evacuation plan. But if Betty, the church admin, doesn't stick to it and make sure that the volunteers are constantly reinforcing the evacuation plan, then in 6 months or 9 months, it's all going to fall apart. And the people are not going to stick to it and not going to constantly be reminded of it. And that's where it's going to become a problem. And then we're going to end up at trial and people are going to testify, well, Betty mentioned it once or twice and then printed up a few things that are on the wall in each of the kids' rooms, but it was never mentioned again. And nobody ever mentioned it to the parents. And then we're going to look foolish in front of the jury. And then the jury is going to come back with a multi-million-dollar judgment when there's an injury or a death because of the inadequate evacuation plan. And I don't want that. I don't want that for my clients. So let's talk a minute about the volunteer training. Are we training our volunteers regarding appropriate teenager and preteen touching? Very concerned about this. because this is where a lot of churches get into trouble. How are we training our men and women volunteers about how to touch teenagers and preteens? Our teenagers and preteens are very touchy-feely with each other. Maybe not so much post-COVID, but don't take my word for that. They love to hug each other. And so what's happened with a lot of situations is that they hug each other constantly. And so with our volunteers, there's a lot of hugging that tends to go on. So what's happened with church work and church volunteer training is that we try to discourage adult child under 18 full hugs, full front hugs. I'm a man, 54 years old. I should not front hug anyone under 18. A female under 18, I should not front hug that child. If I were volunteering with youth under 18, a high school girl, I should not hug her full front. That should be prohibited by the volunteer training in church. If I'm volunteering with high school girls, I should control myself and be trained that I would not hug a full front hug to any girl under 18. But that's incumbent upon me to control that. I can side hug my hand on the shoulder, arm on the shoulder of a girl under 18, but that requires me to shift my body to the side. If a girl comes at me to hug me because she's glad to see me, hey, I'm Scott, I'm glad you're at this event, we're bowling, we're doing pickleball, or whatever the event is for the youth group. And she says, hey, Scott, glad you're here, blah, 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 whatever. And she's running at me to give me a hug. I need to turn and put my arm on her shoulder. That's the hug that she gets from me, if she wants that. I don't know why anybody would want to hug me. Always thrilled to hug my wife and my kids. I've got 3 daughters. But that's the hug that I can give as a volunteer. To me, hugging is touching. Any man that hugs a child under 18, that's an inappropriate touching, because there is the possibility that I or any man could be gratified by that. And so the side hug shouldn't be a problem. I don't think a jury would find that if I turn to the side and put my hand on the shoulder as a greeting, that would be a problem. I'm not sure that anyone under 18 would feel that that was an assault to greet someone with a side hug. We're pretty confident in the world of representing churches as lawyers that a side hug is not a problem. Why is a full-on front hug a problem? It's a problem because the full frontal hug is it's just more impressive of a woman's body on a man's body, and it's just problematic, and we shouldn't be doing it in volunteer church work with someone under 18. A girl's body is more mature, and it can lead to problems. So should volunteers be texting teenagers? In church work, when we are doing volunteer training, we don't have a problem with the volunteer texting the teenagers to coordinate meeting times and places. Back to my earlier example, the junior high small group where the woman is hosting to coordinate meeting times and places. Hey, everybody, this week we're going to meet at Starbucks. Hey, everybody, this week we're going to be at my house. Y'all have been to my house. You remember it's at 123 Mulberry Street. And my stepson's not going to be there this week. I know that he was sort of obnoxious last week. His TV was kind of loud. He's not going to be there. And maybe that's the only thing that's mentioned. You know, no problem. Where we've had some problems in the past is where maybe a volunteer might say, I love you, to a teenager that is not in the volunteer's family, opposite sex. And to me, this crosses a line. This crosses a line. And every family is a little different about what I love you means. And, you know, in the Bible, you know, there's the multiple Greek words for the word love. And there's a sibling type of love, and there's a spousal kind of love. There's a sexual type of love. And it's problematic and confusing when a small group leader says confusing things to teenagers over text or even in person. And someone might say, well, you know, I love you in a familial type way, but it's confusing. And so the volunteer training is important because someone might say, well, I love you like a daughter, or I love you in a familial sense, but it's confusing, and it could be viewed by someone as grooming type behavior. And someone might even say, well, why would you even have to say that? Well, to some people, it would never occur to them to say something like that. But to other people, it just would be completely normal. We're friends. Of course, I'm going to say, I love you. I love you, man. You know, sometimes dudes say this kind of stuff to each other. Hey, man, I love you, man. Dudes say weird things like this every once in a while because they're friends. So why wouldn't I say it to someone in my small group? If I'm the leader, love you, man. Well, I love you means different things to different people in different contexts. And so you say, well, when I go to Buffalo Wild Wings and I'm watching a game with my buds, I might say, I love you, man, over a beer. Well, that doesn't mean you can say it to an opposite sex person in the small group that your wife is leading at your house, that you're not even actually leading, but you're just hanging out in the kitchen and you get to know the girls in the small group, but you're just kind of hanging out there, working in the garage, grabbing a Diet Coke from the refrigerator every once in a while. You're not even part of it. And you just happen to get to know these kids because you're hanging out in the house while your wife is doing the small group. You don't get to say I love you to those kids, but it happens every once in a while. It's part of volunteer training we have to be careful about. So here's kind of a thought. You know, you thought about any of this? Are you training anybody who's working with youth about any of these issues? About appropriate teenager and preteen touching, the hugs, the side hugs. Do you even think about it? The volunteers texting the teenagers about anything other than coordinating meeting times and places, or are you just leaving it to happenstance? Or do you believe, and I mean this sincerely, do you believe that the collective faith shield of your church is so strong that none of these bad things could happen at your church? And that's why you haven't thought about any of this and haven't taken any action, is because your church's faith, collective faith shield, the faith of everybody there, stitched together is so strong that these things can't happen. And I'm not joking around about that. I've encountered many church clients who believe that the collective faith shield stitched together by all of the people in the congregation is so strong that these things can literally not happen at their church. If you haven't thought about any of these things and something bad happens, a jury will tell you that you should have thought about it if something bad happens. And the jury will be unforgiving. Jury will say, should have thought about this stuff if something bad happens. The jury will be unforgiving. Let's talk briefly about Arizona's duty to report. Every state in the country has a duty to report sexual misconduct statute. So Arizona's duty to report statute starts with the premise that anyone who has responsibility for the care or treatment of a minor may have a duty to report. So we've struggled with this because during Sunday services, the people in childcare have the responsibility for the care or treatment of the minor for that couple of hours. On Tuesday night, during the small group at the house, that person has responsibility for the care or treatment of the minor. Why do I say they may have a duty to report? Because it's dependent upon the person having a reasonable belief that the minor is or has been a victim of a reportable offense. What's a reportable offense? Sexual abuse, misconduct, abuse, rape, incest, all of those things. Basically, has the person been abused? Have they been raped? All of those things. There is a clergy exception. Arizona is one of only a handful of states that has a clergy exception. And so you can't assume that these things apply all over the country. Arizona's statute is somewhat unique, but the clergy exception says that if the entire basis of the belief is a confession, and the person who has the reasonable belief is clergy, which, is a somewhat, it's not that complicated of a determination, but basically you're a pastor, and the confession is part of the religious structure. And the statute was sort of drafted based on Catholicism. So not every church that I represent has confession as part of the structure of the religion. But it's not that strict. Basically, if you're a pastor and you're kind of like ordained as part of the clergy. So if the entire basis is a confession and you're clergy, but if you have a reasonable belief based on something other than the confession, then you have a mandatory duty to report it to law enforcement. Now, what makes the duty to report a little tricky for churches is that the duty to report statute also applies, the exact same statute also applies to teachers and other mandatory reporters, such as doctors, emergency room personnel, teachers, and they're trained on it constantly. And those are people that often volunteer in churches on Sunday morning. Often teachers and other mandatory reporters end up on Sunday morning. And so we end up in some conflict sometimes in churches where people who are trained on the duty to report end up in Sunday morning classrooms, and they encounter a kid who has a strange looking injury on their body. It looks like a cigarette burn. Let's just make something up here. And the person says, that looks like a cigarette burn. This kid might be the victim of child abuse. That's a mandatory report. I am at church. I'm a mandatory reporter. I'm a teacher. I need to call that in. I'm calling 911. And where we end up with a clash of expectations sometimes is that the church doesn't particularly, not always, but every once in a while, the church is not really in the mood to have a swarm of police cars in the church parking lot on Sunday morning, dealing with this duty to report because of the cigarette burn on the kid's arm. It's not a great look. I mean, let's concede the point. I mean, that's not exactly what the church wants. Is, family brings their kid to church and some overzealous nursery worker calls the cops and there's 5 cruisers in the parking lot just as people are leaving the service. It's not exactly the great look. I mean, let's just concede that. And so we end up with this problem that the volunteer says, I'm a mandatory reporter, I have to call that in. What we've learned over the years with this duty to report is that law enforcement, last bullet point on the screen, law enforcement personnel have zero tolerance, absolutely zero tolerance for church policies that require report to your supervisor here at the church. When you see something, say something to your supervisor. Please don't call law enforcement. Law enforcement, zero tolerance. And it turns out that law enforcement is correct on this point from a legal perspective under the statute. Absolutely zero tolerance. Because the statute says, if you have a reasonable belief that the minor is or has been a victim of a reportable offense, call law enforcement or Child Protective Services. And anyone who has a responsibility for the care or treatment of a minor is a mandatory reporter. Forget about the clergy part. If you're in the room and you have responsibility for the care or treatment of the minor, you're a mandatory reporter. And the church has no right under the statute to insert a, please don't call law enforcement, call your volunteer supervisor. We'll figure out what to do. That's not correct under the law. It's not correct. And law enforcement has zero tolerance for this. Now, here's what we know. We know that the sex crimes detectives who get involved in these cases do not appreciate on any level churches who get in the way of their investigations. There may be reasons for that. And I don't mean to talk about individual people or individual detectives who get frustrated by this. But every time that I've encountered a detective who is frustrated by one of my church clients who got in the way, who stepped in between a report and law enforcement, extremely frustrated. Correctly, under the statute, correctly frustrated. And so I can't say they're wrong to be frustrated, but universally frustrated. So here's what I've done over the years. There's a flow chart. Yes, no questions, very binary. Do you reasonably believe that a minor is or has been a victim of a reportable offense? No, no duty to report. Yes, are you a member of the clergy or a priest who has responsibility for the care or treatment of the minor? No, no duty to report. If yes, keep answering the questions. It's basically a series of questions. And then there's also a question about whether it's sexual conduct where both minors are certain ages within the teenage years, and that creates a bit of an exception. I have created this flow chart in the form of a handout that is a duty to report. Actually, I have a graphics guy that did it. I said I created it. The content is something I created from the statute, but I have this handout that has the flow chart. And unfortunately for church leaders, it doesn't say go to your volunteer coordinator. I mean, it's not helpful in that sense because that's wrong legally. But this resource is available. I have a bunch of copies. I'm happy to give them out. If you email info@carpenter.law, happy to provide them. If anybody wants some extra copies, happy to provide them. But this duty to report flow chart is available as a free resource from the Carpenter Law Firm. Happy to provide it if anybody would like some extra copies. Whether it's for church leadership or lay leadership, pastors, or even volunteers, it might be helpful, at least until the statutes are changed. There was a recent court case that affirmed the clergy exception, but it really didn't change anything about the statute. The legislature, there has been a legislator who has been trying to change the clergy exception to take it away, but nothing's changed on that. A Democrat legislator who's been troubled by that possibility because it's perceived by some to make it easier for offenders to get away with abuses, but nothing's changed on that. I'm not sure that'll change anytime soon. So at this point, I'm happy to take questions if there are any in the chat or the Q&A. If not, this is right at about 59 minutes. Happy to have provided this. The Carpenter Law Firm endeavors to provide legal services to churches and other nonprofits throughout Arizona. If I can ever be of assistance, please feel free to reach out. Happy to help if I can. Thank you very much.